Sustainable change cannot happen without the expertise of the community that is most impacted. And that is what today's nonprofit works for sustainable change. Hi, I'm Tej, host of Chizuba Talks, where we share stories of nonprofits and their leaders. Patrice Sulton is the founder and executive director of DC Justice Lab, a collective of law and policy experts committed to revolutionizing the criminal legal system. Patrice is an attorney, criminal justice reform advocate, community organizer, and law school professor who is powering a movement to fundamentally transform the criminal justice system in Washington, D.C. For the uninitiated, Washington, D.C. has one of the highest incarceration rates in the country. She served on the District of Columbia's Criminal Code Reform Commission, the Police Reform Commission, and Jails and Justice Task Force. Let us explore how the DC Justice Lab is paving the way for a national model of justice reform in the District of Columbia. Welcome to the podcast, Patrice.
Thank you so much for having me on.
Patrice, so tell us what are the specific areas of research and policy that the organization DC Justice Lab focuses on within the criminal legal system?
So, we have a small geographic concentration, the District of Columbia, the nation's capital, which is a major city, but not an enormous city compared to some of the other large cities in the US. But our issue area of focus is quite broad. It is every intercept of the criminal legal system. So, you mentioned the three task forces on which I served, and those really
Right.
tackle policing, prosecution, and punishment. And we work on all of those parts of the criminal legal system
Hmm.
here.
Hmm. Right. And how do you approach the developing evidence driven solutions for public safety and justice reform?
So, I started the organization working with law students as the main research engine for these reforms. And what was great about the way they tackled their approach to policy change is that it didn't just include legal research and writing. Of course, they needed to understand the state of constitutional law in the US,
Hmm.
but they also
Hmm.
needed to meet and speak with people who had encountered the kinds of policing tactics that they wanted to see changed, who had endured the conditions at DC jail that they knew were not fair and not humane, who had been prosecuted in a way that they understood to be misaligned with what the electorate believed was happening in our courtrooms and wanted to be happening in our courtrooms. And so I've really found that the way our agenda has evolved over time is based not only on traditional kinds of research, but also involving people who have experienced these things firsthand in the formation of policy in a way that they've been excluded in the past.
Okay. So, can you highlight any specific initiatives or campaigns that you have undertaken to advocate these changes?
Yes. So when we began in 2020, perhaps unsurprisingly, our biggest focus was changing policing in the District of Columbia. And that
Mm-hmm.
was, of course, an immediate response to the crisis in policing that has long existed, becoming the source of national attention and a global movement to end state violence. And we really organized our agenda around specific policing tactics. We looked at what are all the different ways that police inflict violence on community, and how do we limit that to when it is only necessary and appropriate, or ban it altogether when it's never necessary or appropriate. And so that was really a matter of thinking through all of the different ways that police encounter citizens, whether it's a stop on the street, a car being pulled over, a search of someone's home subject to a warrant or pursuant to a warrant, and all of those different ways in which police interact. And so our reforms are really organized around all of those different kinds of policing tactics.
Right. So you make sure that the changes are, racially just and systemic inequalities are addressed. So, how are you received in the administration? How are you received with these changes? Is it accepted, or do you really have to fight for it?
A lot has changed since 2020. I think there was a lot of momentum based on the public
Yes.
opinion forcing, ideas that used to seem radical into the mainstream. Since then, as social movements are always cyclical, we've begun to see the backlash toward the sorts of changes that have happened here and elsewhere in the United States. And so being situated in Washington, D.C. has proven to be
Mhm.
especially challenging because not only are we
Hmm.
dealing with detractors who are in our city, we're also having all of those laws that our city does want to change, that everyone does agree on, reviewed by a Congress that doesn't want to let DC govern itself. So there were several
Hmm.
laws that were passed toward the end of last year that the House and Senate were allowed to say DC doesn't have the authority to pass because we are not a state in the United States.
Ah, okay. Do you have any collaborations that help you with the work that you're doing?
Yes, we have, really become part of a constellation of organizations that are interested in this issue of statehood, local control, and self governance called Hands Off DC. And we also partner frequently with member based organizations that are comprised of people who are directly impacted, whether they're victims or formerly incarcerated, or somehow have touched the criminal justice system in one way or the other. We also count ourselves among the legal scholars and attorneys who have really put themselves on the front line of being movement lawyers and pushing reforms forward. And we count ourselves among the activist community in Washington, D.C., that's using direct action to do what law change can't do on its own.
So you do have a lot of support.
I feel like there is a lot of support from the people who live here and understand what public safety is. I feel like we don't have as much support and as much movement forward from the people in decision making and leadership positions who don't want to suffer political consequences for doing what we all understand to be necessary.
Right. That happens everywhere, doesn't it? And how do you aim to, I won't say deal with it. How are you going to challenge that? How are you going to find a way through that?
A huge part of what we've had to do as part of our campaigns is really just making sure that the public understands what's actually going on. What I found is that those who don't want to move in the direction that we're hoping to see movement often cast things in a way that's untrue or easily misunderstood. And so, fact checking and just sharing out accurate information, telling the truth, lifting the veil on the truth has really been a huge part of our work. And to be able to just show
Yes.
this is what's actually happening, this is the hypocrisy, this is the state of the current law, I think has really been a big part of what we contribute, the value that we bring to this really big ecosystem of social change.
Let's take a break to understand what Chizuba is. Everyone at some point ponders on how this beautiful life can be made more meaningful. Maybe you're a leader trying to enhance your employees' experience at your organization. Or you already work for the community and seek volunteers with state of the art skills to strengthen your nonprofit. Whatever your situation, know that you can make a difference. Chizuba began with this very vision, a vision to facilitate every skill and every passion in the world in meeting a social need. Corporate volunteering has several benefits for both businesses and organizations. In parallel, experienced and enthusiastic volunteers join NGO workers, enabling them to serve the community more effectively. Chizuba offers everyone looking to add purpose and meaning to their lives a chance to connect or volunteer virtually with nonprofit organizations from over 100 countries around the world. Visit www.chizuba.net and explore opportunities to find meaning. Chizuba, your platform to do good. And now, back with our guest.
Mm. Do you have you measured any by any metrics or have you measured the success of your advocacy efforts ever, or is it something that it's an ongoing process?
Yeah, we think about it in a few different ways. I mean, one thing that's I think gotten a lot of attention is the sheer number of changes in law that we were able to
Hmm.
move in a short period of time. The effects
Hmm.
of that law are hard to measure at this point in time because they haven't fully taken root. We just finished our budget season in DC, and some of those laws were funded while others weren't. And so until the implementation happens, it will be hard to point to what impact it's had
Right.
on public safety directly and indirectly through creating opportunities for people that we know reduce crime over time. But what I also think is an important measure of our success is changing the way people think and talk about punishment as a community.
Hmm.
And so
Hmm.
when I see new voices at the table, um, in media coverage of these issues, in public hearings on laws the council is considering changing, that to me is also a win. And we certainly have seen a lot of change in the narratives around public safety in DC. And I think we've also drawn a lot of attention to the District of Columbia, outside of our narrow borders here, for other people to understand how serious the mass incarceration crisis is in our nation's capital.
Right. Well, I would assume that DC Justice Lab is, you have are you flooded with a lot of work every day? Do you have to deal with a lot of cases every day that come to you in droves?
Things are very busy because there are three things happening. I mean, one is it's a new organization. And so just building the organization itself is quite a bit of work. The second is our
Yes.
proactive agenda, right? We have all of these things that we know we want to see changed for the better in the world. And the third is really resisting the kinds of harmful change that other people are initiating. And so to be on our back foot or defending, or opposing is also part of our day to day. And so I'm really hoping that we can get momentum back on our side and be more focused on the good ideas that we want to advance, and be able to move away from some of the bad ideas that we've been resisting for the last several months.
Patrice, would you have any advice for somebody in any corner of the world who wants to have some similar kind of a nonprofit where they take some stand about the criminal justice system and they want to make some changes to it? Would you have any word of advice for them?
I think part of DC Justice Lab's secret sauce, so to speak, is that we work with people who are not so accustomed to the world as it is that they can imagine it how it should be. And so, as an attorney and a law professor, I am so cabined in by my understanding of our current laws and rules that often it's hard for me to wipe the slate clean and imagine bigger and better. So working with students, working with artists, and working with people who, think more common sense in a more of a common sense fashion about these things has been a real advantage. And so I think that's why DC Justice Lab is working so well, is that we have students and others who constantly ask, why is it so? And how
Why?
did this
Yeah.
happen? Instead of just accepting things as they are.
Yes. So important. And as a community, also to be aware of the things that are happening around you, very important. So, what do you see? How do you envision yourself or the organization, in the near future, 3 years, 5 years down the line?
Well, I think like a lot of nonprofit founders, I started with the goal of putting us out of business, right? How do we get to the point where this effort isn't needed anymore and we have the kind of success, that we say, the world can move on to tackle other challenges? And so, um, as I think about how we're going to grow in the near term, the biggest change that excites me is building on the policy successes that we've had in our first few years, arming other pro-Black community-based organizations with that know-how so that they can also move law change is a really important next initiative of ours. So between training the community through a policy training academy, growing the engagement we have with law students and young lawyers through our fellowship program, and just continuing to strengthen our pro Black public safety agenda. I'm really excited about the next 3 years.
Well, I wish you luck for the next 3 years and ahead also. And lastly, if anybody has a will to help you out, if anybody wants to get involved or support the work that you are doing, what how can they help?
Oh, thank you so much for that question. A lot of what we aim to do is raise awareness around all of our work. And so, following us on our social media channels, subscribing to our newsletter, sharing articles that we write with friends really does go a long way. And of course, we will be in touch with ways to help throughout the year. And I just look forward to growing the community of people who are informed of all the things that we're working on.
Informed is a key word here. Absolutely wonderful. Well, Patrice, thank you so much for being on the show today.
Thank you so much for having me and for doing this. I love what you're doing.
I love it too. I just enjoy talking to people and leaders who are making these amazing changes so that society becomes a better place. And it takes a lot of courage, it takes a lot of energy and time. And I appreciate that publicly on this podcast.
Thank you so much.